Tonight I'd like to talk a little bit about right view, which is one of the factors of the past. The old view that was predominant in the West about Buddhism was that Buddhism is very basically pessimistic. It talks about suffering. More recently, people have begun to realize that actually Buddhism has a lot to say about happiness, but the common view about the kind of happiness that Buddhism teaches is still very pessimistic. In other words, you have to accept the fact that things come and they go, and pleasures come and pleasures come and go, and pains come and go. Can't do too much about them, so you have to learn to be at peace with their coming and going, and that's how you find happiness. Which is, when you think about it, is very defeatist and very pessimistic. It doesn't open the idea of that there might be a higher happiness available. And it goes very much against what the Buddha taught about wisdom, is that wisdom begins by recognizing that some forms of happiness are more long-lasting than others, and you have to work to give rise to them, and it's worth working to give rise to them. In fact, the question that the Buddha says lies at the beginning of wisdom is, what, when I do it, will lead to my long-term welfare and happiness? Recognizing that long-term is possible, and it's better than short-term. And it has to be done in your actions. That's where the wisdom comes from. And then based on that, you develop wisdom to higher and higher levels. From this basic question also comes the issue of goodwill and compassion, because you realize that your happiness cannot depend on the suffering of others if it's going to be long-lasting. I think I've told you the story about King Basenadi and Queen Malika. They're up in their private apartments, and in a tender moment the king turns to the queen and says, "Is there anyone you love more than yourself?" And you know what he's thinking, a typical king. Or you might say a typical man. Yes, Your Majesty, he's expecting her to say, "I love you more than I love myself." And if this were a Hollywood movie, she might say that. But this is the Pali Canon. And Queen Malika is no fool. And she says, "No, there's nobody I love more than myself. And how about you? Anybody you love more than yourself?" And she's got him. And he says, "I'm afraid no." So that's the end of that scene. This is the kind of love scene that monks like, you know. So the king goes down to see the Buddha and reports the conversation. And the Buddha says, "You know, she's right. You could search the whole world over and not find anybody that you love more than yourself. And in the same way, everybody else loves themselves just that much, just that fiercely." In fact, is the word he uses. And so the conclusion he draws is not that it's a dog-eat-dog world. Instead, he says, you should be careful never to cause any harm to anyone else if you're looking for happiness. So if you want a long-term happiness, it's not only wise to look for long-term happiness, but it's the beginning of compassion. That there are things that you're going to have to do to find a happiness that will last, and that includes taking into consideration the well-being of other people. It's interesting here that the teaching the Buddha is giving to the king is the same teaching that he gives to a group of young boys. The group of young boys are beating a snake with a stick one time. And he asked them, "Are you looking for happiness?" And they said, "Yes." "Then why are you harming other beings?" I think it's interesting that the king and the young boys are on the same level, just learning that basic principle. So the beginning of wisdom, as I said, comes from the realization that some forms of happiness are more long-term than others. So it's not just a question of things coming and going and just learning how to be okay with their coming and going. But this has become a popular conception. I was reading a book recently where the guy was reporting his understanding of Buddhism was that it's like being on a beach watching the waves come in, and you realize that the waves are beyond your power. They're going to be good waves and they're going to be bad waves, but you can't keep the good waves and you can't keep away the bad waves. You just have to learn how to be okay with the good and the bad coming, and that's wisdom. And that's the Buddhist take on happiness, which is a gross misunderstanding. I want to talk about why. The question is, where did this misunderstanding come from? And I think part of it comes from an issue that at the beginning might sound a little bit technical and abstract, but it actually has a lot of practical applications. And the question is, if you ask somebody who knows Theravada, which are the Buddha's most important wisdom teachings, and they would probably say the Four Noble Truths and the Three Characteristics. Kind of basic wisdom. The question is, which of those two is more basic? And I found it interesting. Recently I was working on a book on the Eightfold Path, so I was reading other people's books on the Eightfold Path, and you get into the question of right view, and some of them will just out and out say the three characteristics is what right view is. Others would start out by saying the Four Noble Truths are right view, but why are the Four Noble Truths true? It's because of the three characteristics. Then suffering is in the clinging. And why does suffering cause clinging? It's because you're clinging. Why does clinging cause suffering? It's because you cling to things that are going to change, and you're going to get disappointed. So therefore, it's, in this case, the three characteristics become the more basic of the two teachings. In other words, the teachings about the way things are. And then it's because we don't understand the way things are, then it's because we suffer. Which was not the Buddha's original position. His original position was the other way around. The Four Noble Truths come first. And within the Four Noble Truths, he taught what he didn't call them three characteristics, he called them perceptions. You apply these perceptions in the context of the Four Noble Truths. Now remember, the Four Noble Truths are their suffering, which is clinging to the five aggregates. The cause of suffering, which is craving. The relationship between clinging and craving is that craving, the word for craving is also the word for thirst. And as I said earlier, the word for clinging is also the word to feed. You get thirsty or hungry for something and you look for something to feed on. And it's an interesting insight that we suffer in feeding. Now this is not just physical feeding, but also emotional. The sustenance you get off of other people or situations, or having, say, a particular position in life where you feed off of that. And the Buddha says that's their suffering. The clinging itself is the suffering. The end to suffering is the end of the craving that leads you to cling. And then the fourth Noble Truth is the path, the practice that leads you to cut through that craving and being able to put it aside. It includes practices of virtue, concentration, and discernment. Each of these truths has a duty. Suffering is something you want to comprehend. Now, comprehend means you watch it and you understand it to the point where you develop dispassion for it, i.e. the things you're feeding on. The duty with regard to craving is that you try to abandon it. The duty with regard to the cessation is that you try to realize it, and the duty with regard to the path is that you develop it. Now, the first three duties there have a lot to do with dispassion. Dispassion for the things that you suffer, that you're feeding on, dispassion for the craving, and then the third Noble Truth, of course, is the process of developing dispassion. For the path, though, you have to have some passion. You have to want to do it. You have to want to do it well. Desire is an important part of this. In fact, the Four Noble Truths actually reflect another one of the Buddhist teachings, which is that all phenomena, with the exception of nirvana, are based on desire. As he says, rooted in desire. The fact that you are experiencing things right now comes from your desire to experience them. And so the question is not so much trying to get away with, just drop desire and be done with it. You learn as part of the path to develop better desires. Desires that actually will lead to the end of suffering rather than causing suffering. Now within the context of this structure, then the three perceptions come in. Perceptions of inconstancy, in other words, that things are unstable. Because they're unstable, they are stressful. And because they're stressful, they are not worth calling yourself. Now that's a value judgment. Well, that's an important point. We'll get back to this later. He's just basically saying it's not worth it to say, this is me, this is mine, this is what I am. Because it's going to lead to more stress and lead to more suffering as you cling to it. So you develop this, seeing that these things are inconstant, they're stressful. Why claim them as yourself, especially if you're looking for happiness? So when you're practicing virtue, say, you hold on to your virtue, but then you use the three characteristics to regard the other things that would pull you away from the precepts. You're practicing concentration. You hold on to your concentration. You use the three perceptions to deal with things that would pull you out of your concentration. You protect these practices until they are fully developed, and then you start using your wisdom, your discernment, first to any subtle things that you might be, that are unskillful, that you might still be attracted to, and you develop dispassion for that. And then finally, when you're taking care of all of that, then you turn it around on the path itself. And you begin to realize that even virtue, concentration, discernment, are also inconstant, stressful, not self. And that's when you let them go. So it's a strategic use of these things. You don't just come out and apply them right away. There's a passage where a young monk is being questioned by a member of another sect, and he says, "What does the Buddha say is the result of action?" And the young monk says, "Action results in stress." And then Rhonda says, "I never heard that from any other Buddhist monk. You better go back to the Buddha and check on that." So the young monk goes to see Ananda, and Ananda brings him in to see the Buddha. And the Buddha basically says, "You fool." That was not the right answer to that question. And Udayan, who was a monk who, he's a funny figure. Sometimes he's good and sometimes he's not so good in the canon. He comes and says, well, maybe he's thinking about the teaching that all feelings are stressful. And the three characteristics or the three perceptions. And the Buddha said, "You fool." Again, that's not the right time for this. When you're asked questions about karma, you talk about the three types of feeling. Some things are relatively pleasant, some things are relatively painful, and some are neutral. This is not the time for the three characteristics, or the three perceptions, as he called them. So this is a teaching that has its time and place, and you have to learn how to use it right in its time and place. So within the context, now the Four Noble Truths, the points to remember are that, one, clinging is the suffering. Just the simple fact that you have to be feeding on something that in and of itself is suffering. Because there are times when the mind is going to cling to things that are permanent. Your first experience of the deathless, the mind will have a tendency to grab onto it. Because we're like little children. We go through life and stuff things in our mouth. And even though we're not crawling around the floor, stuff things in our mouth physically, we go through life finding what can I feed on, what can I feed on, what can I feed on. And so you're meditating, you start feeding on the concentration, you have your first experience of the deathless, right in the mouth. Okay, and so that's why the Buddha says not only are inconstant things not self, but even anything that might be just any kind of phenomena at all, constant or inconstant, if you cling to it as self, there's going to be suffering. So the clinging itself is what is the suffering. That's one point to remember. And that is, the clinging is also feeding. Secondly, we cling to things because we get pleasure out of them. If they didn't offer any pleasure, as the Buddha said, we wouldn't cling. So that's why we cling. We can get some pleasure out of it. It's basically that's that part of the mind that calculates, this is going to take some work. Is it worth the work to get this? And our problem is usually that we're pretty bad calculators. I was reading a piece a while back about this guy who was a native of Las Vegas, and he says what he likes about Las Vegas is that Las Vegas is very honest. And that they will put up signs on the way to Las Vegas. They say, our casinos have a 93% payback rate. And people still go. In other words, they're saying, you give us $1, we'll give you back 93 cents. And people will still go. We're very bad about calculating the effort that goes in, and the results are going to come back out. There was one of those positive psychologists I was reading back about several years ago. He was saying when he started working on this project to figure out what people do to make them happy, and he would ask them, okay, there would be a questionnaire, what makes you happy? And then he would actually talk to the people in the midst of doing whatever that was. And I think they had one exception that he did not talk to them about, but while they were doing it. But otherwise, he found out that they were not all that happy while they're doing it. And the question is, why are people so stupid? They anticipate something that's going to be happy, and then after it's done, they said it made them happy, but while they were doing it, they were not all that happy. And then he reflected on himself. He was a mountain climber. Now, if there's anything stupid, it's climbing mountains and getting up to the top and then coming back down again. And thinking that it makes you happy. Because he said he began to realize he was really miserable as he was climbing the mountain and coming back down. But as soon as he was done, he was anticipating the next time he could do it. So this is our main problem, is that we are bad calculators as to what is worth the effort that goes into it. And this is why we cling. We think that this is going to pay me back. With enough pleasure, I'll go for it. Okay. However, That's the original position. You start out with the Four Noble Truths, and within the Four Noble Truths you apply the three perceptions. Now, someplace along the line, things got switched around. The three perceptions became the three characteristics. Characteristics of all things that are conditioned. They are inconstant, stressful. And because they're inconstant and stressful, a further conclusion was drawn that there is no self. In other words, this became a sort of a metaphysical kind of teaching about this is the way reality is. You look in the commentary, and when they talk about what are the Buddhist categorical teachings, i.e. the teachings true across the board, they will go with the three characteristics, which is the opposite of the Buddha. When he was asked what are his categorical teachings, one, teaching that all skillful qualities should be developed, unskillful qualities should be abandoned, and then two, the Four Noble Truths. And as we saw, that he did not teach the three perceptions as an across-the-board kind of teaching. But all of a sudden in the commentary, that became the categorical teaching that was kind of the basic truth of Buddhism. Therefore, everything's are inconstant, they have no essence, therefore there is no self. When there is no self, there is no agent. In other words, there are just phenomena kind of rolling on, but there's nobody really in there making decisions. You can begin to see where this is beginning to go. In other words, in this case, clinging causes suffering. This clinging is not the same thing as suffering. Clinging causes suffering because we're clinging to inconstant things. One point. The second point, ignorance is not in the past with the Buddha, it was not knowing things in terms of the Four Noble Truths. Ignorance is not knowing that there is no self. Not knowing that things are inconstant, not knowing that there is no self. That becomes the new definition of what ignorance is. And basically, in this understanding, then we cling to things with the mistaken view that they are permanent, that they are self. That there's something lasting there. And if we understood that everything was impermanent, then we wouldn't cling anymore. Now, when was the last time you told yourself, okay, I'm clinging to my relationship because I think it will last forever? Or if, I'm clinging to this bowl. Do I cling to this bowl because I think it's going to last forever? No. I'm clinging to the bowl because it's going to give me pleasure somehow. So again, you see that the difference that has been made in this, it becomes a metaphysical issue. And something all you have to do is erase your misunderstanding that things are permanent. You will not cling anymore. And so this is where the modern view that, okay, basically the three characteristics are more basic comes from. And if you start looking in the popular literature, you begin to see some of the implications that are drawn from this. One is that I just said now, because there is no self, there's no agent. We're essentially on the receiving end of our experience. And we suffer because we try to exert control over things. We try to resist change. Okay. In other words, if we just learn how to accept it, we'd be okay. The second one, to cling, means to hold on to something with a misunderstanding that it's permanent. Now, clinging causes suffering. I have to read this. Okay. Because it tries to resist change. For this reason, as long as you understand that things are impermanent, you can embrace them in the knowledge that they were going to end and just kind of let them go when the time comes to end. You can embrace them briefly as they arise in the present moment, and it doesn't count as clinging. Because you understand this is impermanent, so I will just kind of enjoy this experience and then kind of let it go. I would say that would not count as clinging. As long as you're fully in the present moment with no expectations about the future, you're okay. And then the third misunderstanding about what the Buddha is teaching is that clinging means holding on to fixed views about right and wrong, what should and should not be done. Okay. If you have set ideas about right or wrong or how things should be, even about the Buddhist teaching should be interpreted, you're going to suffer. But if you can let go of your fixed views and simply accept the way things are as the way they have to be, you're going to be fine. Now, those three misunderstandings. The first two can be illustrated by that image of sitting on the beach, watching the waves roll in, because the ocean is totally out of your control. You just have to learn to be okay with the fact that they're going to come in different ways. And as long as you are okay with the waves and kind of embrace the waves when they come in, but let them go, there'll be no clinging. The third principle is that we should not hold on to any fixed views. I think was well illustrated by an explanation I saw in an interview that was on French TV a while back. This Buddhologist was giving a presentation on dependent core rising. The interviewer was a woman, and she asked him, could you talk about what are the practical implications of this teaching on impermanence and dependent core rising? And he gave a really French definition of dependent core rising, which is that, well, it basically comes down to, we have to accept the fact that my love for you today is going to be different from my love for you yesterday. That was just so classic, I mean. And the look she gave him showed that she was not interested in this teaching, okay? So it's good to compare that image, particularly of the waves coming on shore, with the Buddhist image of the path, which is basically you are crossing over a river, and you're going to end up standing on firm ground beyond the flood. Now that's, for him, that's what the practice is all about. We're not just sitting on the beach watching the waves. There's a flood, and you're actually going to get across that flood by holding on to the raft, which is the Eightfold Path. And then you get to a place of safety. Now at that point you can put the raft aside, you don't have to carry it around with you. But you need the raft as you go across, and there's something you can do to get across. Some of the differences here is that in that particular description I told you about the waves coming on, that when they talked about good waves and bad waves, they actually put quotation marks around the word good and around the word bad. The Buddha recognizes there are bad waves, period. There's no quotation marks. There's suffering in the world, and it's something you can go beyond. Okay. Secondly, is you can play an active role. You actually can swim across the river. You're not just sitting there passively accepting things as they're coming to you. You see that there's something good on the other side of the river, and there are things you can do to get there. Okay. And third, there is a place beyond the reach of waves. There's a place of safety where the waves are not going to hit you at all. Because you think about that image of being on the ocean. Well, you've been on the Oregon coast during a storm. You know what it's like. When bad waves come in, they're not bad just in quotation marks. I mean, they can kill you. I mean, why do we have all these tsunami signs around? Okay. The Buddha's image of crossing over gives also perspective on the whole question about fixed views. Because it turns out that when the Buddha describes this flood that you're going across, it's a flood of four things. It's a flood of sensuality, the flood of becoming, the flood of ignorance, and the flood of views. This is something you're going to go across. But to get across, that raft that's going to take you across includes right view. A right view is a view that can get you across. It's the one view that actually can get you beyond views. And we'll talk a little bit more about the kind of dynamic about why this is. This is partly because it's always true. In that sense, right view is fixed. What the Buddha taught about suffering is always true. It is clinging. It's in the clinging that the suffering lies. There's no better way to understand suffering. It's always relevant. It's a truth that you can use all the time. To understand if I'm in a situation and I'm suffering from something in the situation, even though the situation may be bad, the fact that I'm suffering actually arises from something in my own mind. I'm taking that outside situation in there and I'm clinging to it in a way that's causing me to suffer. I don't have to do that. So that's always true. So in that sense, it's fixed. It's also responsible because it gives you clear guidance as to how to formulate an understanding of what should and should not be done. The Buddha said this is one of a teacher's most important responsibilities to a student, is to give you principles that allow you to say there are things that should be done and there are things that should not be done, and you can figure them out based on those principles. Whereas if you say, just don't have any fixed views, that doesn't give you any basis at all for even deciding what should or should not be done. There's no real right or wrong. So it's responsible, in addition to being always relevant. And it's something that you hold on to, but it has within it the seeds of its own transcendence. And this is what's special about right view. Because what is right view? It's basically looking at the process of what the mind is doing as it's holding on to something. And so you use it as a tool to look at the various ways that you hold on to things, starting with things that are really unskillful. And then as you kind of clear out what's obviously unskillful, then you go to more and more subtle levels of what is skillful and what is not skillful. And you've finally taken care of that. And then you turn around and look at this process of holding on to the view itself. The view itself does that. And you begin to realize, I'm holding on to this as well. When you can let go of that, it's delivered you to the far shore. Now, the idea that you shouldn't have any fixed views does not do that for you. It kind of leaves you without any guidance, doesn't tell you where to look, what to do. And if you end up letting go of it, it doesn't lead you in any particular place. It's kind of like you're still left in the flood going across and you're just grabbing at whatever comes past. So this is one of the reasons why right view is the image of going across the river. It gives some perspective on that whole idea that you often hear that you should have no fixed views. For example, in the translation of the Garaniya Metta Sutta in this shiny book, it says something about having no fixed views. The Buddha does not use the word fixed view. So, talk to Jambasana about that. Okay. So those are the basic principles. And we are going across a river. It's based on right view and it's based on right effort. Right effort is propelled by desire. Some of the general principles you can draw from this are: one, it's okay to have preferences. It is better to have lack of suffering than it is to have suffering. The end of suffering is a better thing, okay? And it's good to prefer that. You sometimes hear that, the Zen saying that the great way is not difficult for those with no preferences. And the only way that can make sense is if you see that the path is going to require X, and even though you don't like X, you realize, okay, I am going to do whatever the path requires. Now that makes sense. The idea that you should not prefer anything at all, that makes no sense. Okay? So preferences are okay. And it is possible to find a long-term happiness. We're not just stuck with the fact, well, things come and go, and you have to accept the fact that things come and go. There are things that are worth working for. I mean, there's the long-term happiness that comes from practice of, generosity, virtue, goodwill. We'll talk a little bit about this further on. And the sense of well-being, the sense of goodness inside that comes from those practices is really worth going for. The word goodness is something you don't hear that much in our society anymore. A couple of years back, just for the fun of it, I got onto Amazon, and in the little search box, I typed in goodness. And all I got were books on baked goods. Sugar and white flour are goodness, It's sad. Okay. But when you realize, okay, you can give rise to goodness within you, and this is what the practice of merit is all about, and we'll talk about that a little bit more for right now. It's really worthwhile, and that's where really genuine long-term happiness lies. So let's look a little bit more about merit. Because it's one of those concepts that's not appreciated much in the West. It sounds too much like brownie points and Boy Scout badges. And if we translate it simply as the goodness, I think it would make a lot more sense. There's the goodness of generosity, there's the goodness of virtue, and there's the goodness of developing thoughts of unlimited goodwill. These activities are the Buddha's first answer to that question: what, when I do it, will lead to my long-term welfare and happiness? As he said, acts of merit or acts of goodness, that is another word for happiness. And he lists three. As I said, generosity, virtue, and the development of goodwill. Sometimes people think that the pursuit of merit is kind of grubbing and sort of selfish. But how can generosity and virtue and goodwill be selfish? I mean, you're doing it for your own sake, that's true, but at the same time you're spreading the goodness around, and this is an important part of a long-term happiness. There's no clear boundary between who's going to be benefiting from these activities and who's not. I mean, it's both sides benefit in the practice. And the other thing is sometimes it's accused of, it's for people who are not really serious about practicing for release. It's merit, the pursuit of merit is something that Asian Buddhists do who are not serious about meditation, but we're serious Western meditators, and so we're going to go for what's up higher than that. That's not how it works. As the Buddha once said, you're not going to get to the higher practices unless you're generous. Stingy people cannot get into jhana. Say nothing of the higher practices. And at the same time, the practice of working to develop a long-term happiness, that teaches you some important things about elements of the path. For instance, it sees how you change the way you act is going to have an impact on your life. This is an important part of underlying the Four Noble Truths. In the Four Noble Truths, you're changing your desires. And based on that, you change your actions. And the practice of merit shows you, if you haven't been very strict about not lying, if you start to try to, okay, I'm consistently not going to lie, you find that it changes your life for the positive. If you haven't been that generous, you say, well, let's be a bit more giving. It makes a positive impact on your life. Okay. Also teaches you about what the Buddha taught about mindfulness. Mindfulness in the Buddha's teachings is not simply being with things as they arise and pass away. If you see that there's something positive, he calls this mindfulness as a governing principle. You see that there's something positive that's not in your mind, you work to give rise to it. That's a function of mindfulness. You remember to give rise to it. When it's there, you remember to protect it, to protect it from falling away. So you don't just sit there, watch it coming and going. You're actually making it come and keeping it from going. This is a part of mindfulness practice. So I'd like to go a little bit more into the three types of merit. Generosity is the beginning of what the Buddha calls mundane right view. And it teaches you the principle of karma, which is what mundane right view is all about. It teaches you an important principle, i.e. that you have freedom of choice. Mundane right view starts with a statement, there is what is given, which you'd say, duh. Of course, you see it all the time, people giving things. But the Buddha... Didn't you ever think that? But what the Buddha is saying here is something actually had a lot of impact in his time, because the Brahmins, for millennia, were teaching that giving is good if it's given to Brahmins. They actually had funeral ceremonies where they would come to one point and say, okay, we are now speaking in the voice of the dead relatives that have passed away. They would say, give to the Brahmins. So you would give to the Brahmins. And then your dead relatives were supposed to say, give more. After centuries of this, you can imagine people got tired of it. And so there were some beliefs that came around saying that giving, actually, there's nothing really good about giving. And the reasoning that came out of this was one of two things. One is that everything you do is predetermined by the stars or whatever, past karma or whatever. Therefore, the fact that you gave something has nothing to do with your virtue. It's simply that you were forced by conditions that you had to give. So there's no real goodness there. It's just kind of mechanical principles working themselves out. And the second principle is that when everybody dies, that's it. Nothing. Therefore, anything you would do to help somebody eventually just ends up nothing, so why bother? And so when the Buddha says there is what is given, he's denying those two teachings. In other words, things are not predetermined. You have freedom of choice. And at the same time, death is not the end. When you help somebody, the impact can go on for a long, long time. So it's worthwhile. So this is what he means by there is what is given. But the important thing is he teaches freedom of choice. This is why within Buddhism there's this culture around generosity. You've probably heard the principle, generosity, dana, is a 2,500-year-old tradition. Well, the dana talk is not a 2,500-year-old tradition. It's a 35-year-old tradition. Designed to squeeze money out of meditators when they're nice and soft, at the end of the meditation retreat. The Buddha was very careful. He would not talk to people about generosity until they had already given something. Then he would talk about, okay, you rejoice in the fact that you've been generous. He wouldn't give it to pull more money out of your wallet. And King Basanity came to see him one time and basically said, where should a gift be given? Now, he'd heard the Brahmins say, give to Brahmins. The Jains said, give to Jains. And he was expecting the Buddha to say, give to Buddhists. And that's not what the Buddha said. He said, give where you feel inspired or you feel that it would be well used. In other words, you're totally free as to how you give. There's no compulsion. And in fact, for the monks, there's a rule that when we are asked, where should I give X, you have to say, give where you feel inspired or feel it would be well used. A couple years back, I knew this young man whose mother was going to be giving a donation to a Buddhist organization, and she was trying to decide where to give it. And he was trying to get her to give it to Wat Metta. And so he said, what should I tell her? And I said, tell her to give where she feels inspired or feel be well used. And sure enough, she gave it to somebody else. And so I comforted myself and I said, well, I have a precept here that's worth more than $2 million. But the important lesson is, once something is given, freely given, there is a sense of joy that comes from the heart that's not the kind of joy that comes from having to give a Christmas present or having to give a birthday present. When you give because you just want to give, that's something to be nourished, that quality of the heart. And at the same time, you're spreading that goodness around. It's a goodness that creates no boundaries. In other words, if someone had to pay you to get something, there's a boundary right there. This good is not going to come over the boundary until the money comes. But if you just give it freely, that kind of erases boundaries. So it's a goodness that goes all around. And this is something that you can actively do, create something better in your life. So it's not just giving here. It's not just material things. It can be a gift of your time, gift of your energy, gift of your knowledge, gift of your forgiveness. All of these things count as generosity. And these are ways that you create something better in the world. The Buddha said, however, if you want the best results out of giving, there are kind of 4 factors you want to keep in mind. The first is your motivation for why you're giving. The lowest motivation is, I'm going to get this back with interest. The highest motivation is simply, this is something that's just a natural expression of the mind, and you kind of work your way up in terms of what you're expecting or your motivation for giving. The attitude should be done with sympathy for the recipient, show respect, and you believe that something's going to come of it. You feel glad before you do it, you feel serene while you're doing it, and you feel gratified afterwards. That's the kind of attitude you should bring to the act of giving. They tell the story of a millionaire in the time of the Buddha who had everything, but he couldn't enjoy it. He had fine carriages, but he got dizzy if he rode in the carriages. He had fine food, but he'd throw it up if he ate it. He lived in a nice house. Ticks and other insects would attack him, so he had to live in a little tiny hut. And when he died, his fortune went to the kingdom. Didn't leave any heirs. And the monks asked the Buddha about this, and he said, well, in a previous lifetime he had given a gift to a private Buddha, but then afterwards regretted it. Say, I could have given that to somebody else, or I could have kept that. So when you give, be happy that you gave. Okay. So that's basically the Buddha's teaching on generosity, finding happiness through the act of generosity. Virtue basically comes down to the practice of the 5 precepts. You're abstaining from things that would harm yourself or harm other people. And these are for healing the wounds inside of regret and denial. In other words, if you do something unskillful, and you know that it was harmful, then when you sit down and meditate, that's going to come up in your meditation, and the reaction is either going to be you're going to just sit there regretting, I wish I hadn't done that, or you're going to deny that you did something wrong. Now, neither is going to be good for your concentration. Denial in particular is bad. It's like you kind of develop this kind of calcified tissue around your wound. And when you run into that, it's going to be hard to gain insight into what's going on in the mind because you've got these hardened spots in the mind. So it's good to practice, make a general practice. Okay, I'm not going to do anything that's harmful. Now the 5 precepts are kind of the big general rules. Kind of the Buddhists. You don't have to test this and to reinvent the Dharma wheel every time. You make a promise to yourself, I'm not going to break these precepts. Sometimes they're criticized as being hard and fast rules. It's better to think of them as clear-cut guidelines. And as you know, if you raised a child, if the rules are clear-cut, the child is much less neurotic than if the parent is very wishy-washy about this. It's like those pigeons that they experimented on one time. There was one cage, the pigeons had a little button. There's a green button and a red button. And if sometimes you push the red button, you would get food, and sometimes you didn't. And sometimes if you press the green button, you would get food, and sometimes you wouldn't. And in the other cage, it was, okay, if you press the red button, no food. You press the green button, you got food. Okay. The pigeons in the second one were very well-adjusted pigeons. The pigeons in the first one were neurotic. In other words, it's good to have something clear-cut to measure yourself by. And also it's important that, the times when you're most tempted to kill or steal or do something really drastic like that, you need something very clear and short to remember. Because otherwise the mind is going to figure out ways of getting into the complicated folds of your thinking. And also, as I said earlier, with all these forms of merit, it's a really good basis for self-esteem. Again, you can see that there's goodness that comes in within you. Sometimes it's not easy. The Buddha never says that goodness is our true nature. We have both the potential for good and bad within us. And if you realize, okay, I can overcome some of my less skillful tendencies, there's a self-esteem that comes with that. I can actually give rise to goodness within me. That kind of happiness is long-term. And then finally, development of goodwill. I use the word goodwill for metta and not loving kindness because the descriptions in the canon are not about loving someone, they're more about wishing them well. And some of the Buddhists, and especially in the light of the teaching of karma, you have to realize that people are going to be happy not because you are wishing them well, but because they act on the causes of happiness. And so in the cases where the Buddha says, may these beings look after themselves with ease. You're not saying, I'm going to be there for them. You say, may they be there for themselves. There's another one where he says, may no one despise anyone or wish any ill on anyone. Okay, again, you're hoping that they will actually act on the causes of happiness. You don't have to love them. One of my favorite stories from Ajaan Fuang was about a time a snake came and lived in his room. And he'd had an experience earlier years as a monk where he'd encountered a large snake and had basically run away. And he said, okay, from now on, and then he felt embarrassed about that for years afterwards. And so when the snake moved into his room, he said, okay, this time I'm going to train myself to be okay with the snake. And so he spread thoughts of goodwill to the snake every day, until the third night. And he finally said, okay, look, I think I've managed this. And he was sitting and meditating and addressed his thoughts to the snake and basically said, it's not that I have any ill will for you, but we are of different species, and it's very easy for there to be misunderstandings between different species. And it might be better for both of us if you left the room. And there are plenty of places out there where snakes can be happy outside. And so the snake left the room. And you think about it, the snake did not want Ajaan Fuang's loving kindness. It probably would have bitten him if he tried to pet the snake or something. But basically, its goodwill is wishing someone well. The image that they give in the canon is, the Buddha says, suppose there were bandits had pinned you down, and they were sawing your limbs off with a saw. And you have to have goodwill for them. That doesn't mean you're going to have loving kindness for the bandits, but you protect your goodwill, even in a case like that. Because okay, this is probably going to be my death. I better have goodwill, or else I'm going to be coming back and trying to get revenge on these bandits, and that's going to be a bad place to come back. So it's for your good and for theirs that you have goodwill for them. I think another one of the problems that comes up is this passage you sometimes see, that just as a mother would protect her child with her life, in the same way you should cherish all living beings. That's not what the passage says. It says, just as a mother protects her life, you should protect your goodwill in all sorts of circumstances. And that's something you can actually do. Are you going to protect all living beings the same way you would protect your child? No, there's no way. But you can protect your goodwill that way. Okay. And you remember, it is something you have to do. It's not something innate. I mean, we tend to be innately wishing well for certain people, but not everybody. So this is something the Buddha said, this is a mindfulness, something you have to keep in mind. It's a determination. You have to make up your mind you're going to do this. You do it for your own sake. So you'll be able to trust yourself to act skillfully in difficult situations, and not because they were all one or the other person is intrinsically good. But basically, you're doing this to remind yourself, this has to be my motivation to act on this. And it's interesting, the Buddha actually refers to goodwill as a form of restraint. We tend to think of goodwill as kind of opening things up, but Buddhists say you have goodwill as a way of holding yourself back from doing something that might be unskillful. So it's for your own protection. Okay. So these are the three forms of merit, which are the beginning answer to that Buddhist question. What when I do would lead to my long-term welfare and happiness? This is where wisdom comes in. It's in the practice of things like this. Not just sitting back saying, okay, I'll just be okay with whatever happens. Goodness is something that you actually have to give rise to. And the kind of happiness that comes from giving rise to that goodness from within. And again, this is something that you find, you bring up from yourself. The self-esteem that comes from that is one of the best forms of happiness. The Buddha says of these three forms of merit, the development of goodwill is like the moon, and that virtue and generosity are like the stars. Now, the moon is much brighter. But at the same time, would we want a sky that only had a moon? It's good to have the moon and the stars in our practice, because they teach us many important things. As I said, happiness is something that comes from our actions. There is a long-term happiness that can be developed, and it's worth working at to develop, all of which are important lessons that we're going to apply as we go further on the path. In the practice of virtue, you have to be mindful, ardent, and alert, which are qualities of developing mindfulness and concentration, i.e. mindful to keep the precept in mind, alert to what you're doing, and ardent to come and figure out ways when it's difficult to hold to the precept, and you say, well, gosh, if I tell the truth in this particular circumstance, what's going to happen? And you have to figure out some way. I'm not going to tell any lies. There may be a few things that I hold back a little bit, but I'm not going to lie about them. Or in the same way with dealing with termites, pests. How do I deal with these animals in a way that I can maintain the precept and yet not have my house be harmed? You're developing your discernment. And finally, as I said, the happiness that comes from this, the happiness of self-esteem, of a goodness that comes from within. It's not like just simply watching pleasures come and go. This is kind of a happiness, a well-being that really lasts for a long period of time. It gives you a foundation of confidence that you can apply to higher and higher stages of the practice. So this is the Buddhist take on happiness. It's something that you actively work at. It's something you can work at. You can take that raft and you can take it across the river and eventually you come to a place where you don't have to do this anymore. The work is done. But to get there requires work. But it's good work. I mean, what's bad about being generous? What's bad about being virtuous? It's things that feels good while you're doing it, and it's going to lead to good results. So the Buddhist teachings on happiness are not pessimistic at all. He's basically saying, okay, there is an ultimate happiness, and it is within your power to find it. And it begins with simple things like this that we know are good. So there's nothing about the path. This is why the Buddha said the path is good in the beginning, good in the middle, good in the end. It feels good while you're doing it. You know it's a good thing while you're doing it. The Buddha's not asking you to do anything ignoble. But at the same time, he's not teaching you to be lazy. He said, okay, there is a possibility for true happiness, and how optimistic can you get? The happiness that he's promising, nirvana. So there's nothing pessimistic about the Buddhist teachings on happiness, and there's nothing passive or defeatist. As he said, the Eightfold Path, another word for the Eightfold Path is victory in battle. So you're battling against your unskillful tendencies, and as you battle against them, there's a sense of well-being that comes inside. And that's what keeps you going. So those are my thoughts on tonight's topic. You got 2 talks in there. For the price of 1. Any questions? Comments? Yes?
Ajaan, when you talk about loving kindness from that perspective, my experience of loving kindness in meditation is, at least when I did it well, it's a very emotional experience, feeling a great strong feeling towards all beings, similar to what I might feel to sort of the closest people in life, and maybe even beyond what I feel towards the closest people in life on an everyday level. And so, that seems to be slightly different from what I'm hearing you describe. I just wonder if you can kind of speak to those differences.
Okay, well, what's important is that you develop an attitude that, suppose you leave here and you're driving along the road and somebody cuts in front of you.
I might not have it then.
Yeah, exactly. If you're expecting that this means a tender feeling of love, it's not going to work then.
But certainly there's a benefit to cultivating, to bringing up that kind of, using it as a method for bringing up that kind of joy.
Yes, but then at the same time you have to remind yourself, what's the purpose of this? I have to be able to carry this attitude into my actions. So when I'm dealing with difficult people or listening about difficult people on the news, I have to have goodwill. And at that point it's not emotional. Because these are people, a lot of these people, you're not going to like them. But you still have to have goodwill for them. Which is why I think goodwill is better than loving kindness as an attitude. Hand over here. Yes.
So as merit, dana, sila, and bhavana, bhavana, you're describing it as a cultivation of goodwill.
Right.
And is it also described as, is that the bhavana, is it the cultivation of goodwill in that context?
That's how it's described in the context. It's developing goodwill in particular. Yes.
At the Metta Sutta, at the beginning, lists a lot of sort of preconditions for one practicing metta. And it seems, if the interpretation, the way I understand you describe it, it would seem almost the same as those preconditions. In other words, it assumes that you have goodwill.
Not necessarily, but it's basically to make sure that your goodwill is not hypocritical. The way you live your life is something that would be conducive to genuine goodwill and would be an expression of goodwill. There's interesting things like being someone who is easy to criticize. May not necessarily have to involve goodwill, but when you're willing to take criticism from other people, then it's easier not to get upset at them and not lash back at criticism that you get from somebody. So you can know, you can trust yourself. Okay, I have goodwill for even the people who call me a dog, and look around and I don't have a tail. But even though I'll still have goodwill for them. One of my favorite ones is that you don't have a lot of activities, i.e. you don't have a lot of big building projects. I think this is directed mainly at monks. Because if monks have building projects, that someone walks into the monastery and they think, okay, how am I going to get money out of this person? It's like that story they tell about the Shackleton expedition down in Antarctica. They landed on this island and the only source of food they had was penguins. And so every time a penguin walked on the island, poop, into the pot. So if you've got a lot of projects going and you're thinking, the person walks in the room, how can we get money out of them? That's hard for goodwill. Yes?
So you said that in the Karaniya Metta Sutta that it's the by not holding to fixed views, the hard one, not pointing to it. You said that's not a correct translation. We don't use the term fixed views. What term do you use?
Let's use the word views.
Just views.
Yeah. Because there's a point in the practice where you have to let go of all views, right and wrong. But in the meantime, right view is a fixed view until the time has come to let go. Okay. Yes?
Is it better to listen to news and practice goodwill, or just turn it off and try to remove it? I think I can almost answer my own question.
Yeah.
I tend to turn off the radio and not read the news because I don't want to get hooked into it.
Yeah. The basic message of the news is that the important things that are happening in the world are things that somebody else is doing someplace else. And that your time at the current moment, you're not doing anything important at all. Do you want to buy that message? No. I mean, if you have a particular instance of something you want to accomplish in life, and this can be your form of generosity. You know, of those three forms of merit, the one that involves the most creativity is generosity. What do you want to give to other people? And if you want to get involved in some sort of social action or some sort of social activity, okay, you might want to read up on things that are relevant to that, because it's going to be relevant to decisions you make. But there's a lot of stuff going around that's just not relevant to things anything you have any control over. I've left you speechless. Yes.
When you say goodwill, what's the holy word?
Metta. Yeah. Think of somebody you really hate. Now, what's the quality of metta for that person?
Depends on my mindset.
Well, you better have goodwill.
But I mean, you know, even someone I really hate, if, you know, my meditation is good, you know, perhaps I can cultivate a feeling of, you know,
Loving kindness.
openness and love for that person.
I wouldn't open up myself. There's just quite a few people.
Openness in the sense that I want to accept, you know, it's like a good friend, but openness in the sense that I can accept them for who they are and still...
I can accept them for who they are now. Because goodwill for some people who are really misbehaving is, may they change their ways. I think a lot of it, you know, the whole atmosphere around Thai Buddhism, at least practice in the forest tradition, at least as I've learned it, is very much less fuzzy and warm, fuzzy than it is here in the West. I mean, you're dealing with people, you know, sons and daughters of peasants who lived a pretty hard life, and we're used to being in dangerous situations and learning, okay, there are certain things they have to protect. And they didn't open up very easily. And they had goodwill, but they were not open. And I think that's a quality we need to defend ourselves in the society that we're in right now. Yes?
I'm interested in the reasons for generosity and discernment. And maybe the best... Because sometimes we're faced with difficult choices. Someone, you can step up to a task that you know is going to be depleting, yet it could produce good works. Cultivating the discernment to be able to determine the temptation is to say what the right thing to do is. But I have a sense that it's probably not that cut and dry.
It's not that cut and dried. It's one of those things you have to basically learn trial and error. And if you're going to commit yourself to something first, you have to kind of test the waters a little bit. Can I do this? And even though it may be depleting, maybe I can find some stores of energy within myself to replenish that. Will it be worth it then?
As opposed to it being worth it because you know you're doing the good thing, you're getting a good feeling from it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a difference between doing something because it feels good and something because it's skillful. You look at what are the actual results that are coming from this. Is it really good? Because sometimes, we do good because it makes us feel good about ourselves, but it's not all that helpful to the other person. Watch out for that kind of goodness. And again, there's no hard and fast rule. And this is why generosity, as I said, of the three different kinds, is the one where the Buddha leaves the most freedom in your choice of how you're going to do this. And there's the opportunities for creativity are there, but also there's a time you have to realize, okay, to what extent? Because he says you don't want to do this in a way that's going to harm you or harm others. And learning how to read that is going to be kind of the discernment you, as with all discernment, it's, as I say, good judgment comes from experience, and experience comes from bad judgment. So learn to live with that fact. There's a hand back here.
Yeah, I want to know more about information gathering. I just recently felt that I wasn't aware enough of current events, so I started listening to like a 15-minute podcast every morning so I could know more about what was going on. And it's not always a delightful experience, but I know more about what's going on. So I was wondering, based on your other response about finding like a balance between being someone who's engaged and aware, and I want to kind of like exist in the world in a way that's not too happy-go-lucky, or like I'm okay and therefore I assume everyone else is okay too. But how do you balance?
Well, it's I've found that without pursuing the news myself, I learn a lot of news because everybody around you is going to be telling you. And it's again, I don't know if you were here earlier. We were talking about the Buddha's image of the mountains moving in. That we live in this world, basically, that aging, illness, and death are moving in on us. So it's not just everything's okay, but we realize I want to do something good with my life. I want to be able to focus my energy on doing something good, both in inner cultivation and what I can offer to the world around me. And if you find that by listening to the news, it gives you a more sense of urgency that, some idiot's going to start throwing nuclear bombs around and I better do something really good right away with my life so I have something good to carry on to the next lifetime. Okay, then that's okay. But if you find that's getting you depressed or getting you down, it's sapping your energy, then you can turn it off. So that you can focus on what am I doing right now to make me a better person and make the people around me benefit from my presence. Yes?
So, in my practice, I've had a hard time developing patience, like you talked about that earlier, especially with my own thought process. And I was wondering if you could speak to kind of both being patient with your own will, but also staying focused on getting where you are trying to go.
Trying to go. It's interesting, when the Buddha talked about the secrets of his awakening, he says two things. One was he was willing to put in whatever effort was going to be required. And two was he never rested content with the skillfulness of his mind. We hear a lot about contentment. When he talks about contentment, that's largely a matter of your physical surroundings. You're okay with the physical surroundings you're in. But when it comes to your mind, you have to figure out, and this is where you have to learn how to think strategically. How can I actually get rid of those things that I don't like inside of myself? And just being upset about that, of course, is not going to help. But recognizing that this is a problem, and we have to tackle it, and try to do this in as calm and as realistic a way as you can, and try to notice. Okay, when I start going down unskillful trains of thought, instead of just saying, "Oh, aren't I awful?" You say, "Why did I go down that train? What tempted me?" And the Buddha talks about when you want to overcome something inside the mind, there are 5 things you want to see. First is, how does it arise? And not just arising, what originates it, what causes it to come up. And then recognizing it when it goes. Because you see sometimes that these thoughts come and go, but you don't even realize they've gone. For example, with anger. There'll be a thought of anger. And then you notice, oh, my heart's beating and my stomach is all churned up and I have all the physical symptoms of anger. I must be angry. Comes up again. So learn how to read your symptoms. Okay, this is now the hormones are there, they've been churned up, but that doesn't mean that I have to continue down that line of thought. And notice, okay, then when it went, why did it go? There are things that other things are more interesting, or you lose interest in it, or something. But then you churn it up again. It keeps coming back repeatedly. But if you can see that coming and going, you begin to realize, okay, this train of thought I have is not as continuous as I thought. Then you want to look at, what's the allure? Why do I like this? And you may tell yourself again, no, 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 I don't like this. If you didn't like it, you wouldn't go for it. But all too often there are things in the mind that we go for that we don't like to admit to ourselves. So this is why we practice concentration, so we catch the mind as it's going after something. You say, okay, why did you go? Until you can finally say, oh, I thought I was going to get X out of this. And then you look at the drawbacks and you compare, okay, this is what I thought I was going to get, this is what I really get, to the point where you can develop some dispassion for it. And then you can let it go. So that's how you deal with it. You try to be more methodical. Think, okay, these are these 5 steps I have to do to deal with this. They're talking about letting go of your anger. There was a famous monk in Thailand years back who was, reputed to have a pretty sharp tongue. And as some of the rich people in the time used to say, you sit at home and nobody dares criticize you. You have to go see him. He'll criticize you. And there was this one woman, she had lost her son. He was very young, early 20s or something, and he died. And she was just totally overwhelmed with grief. So she went to see him, and she said, I just can't stop thinking about this. I'm thinking about this all the time, and how much I miss him. Is there anything I can do to help forget? And he said to her, you don't really feel that grief for him. You're just saying this because you want to show off to the people around you. She was livid. She didn't even bow down. She just left. And she got home, and about 3 or 4 hours later, she realized she hadn't thought one thought about her son in those 4 hours. So I wouldn't recommend that doing with everybody, but we can forget about these things without realizing that we forgot. We adopt them. Okay. Sorry. Mm-hmm.
Can I ask a follow-up question regarding the answer to on how to solve that? I don't even know if I can rephrase it, but when I was listening to you, I was thinking, I would definitely fall into clinging. I want the answer. Why am I doing this? Why am I? And that would feel like clinging. And I recall somebody saying that instead just focus on your breath and then let it go. And when it's gone, it's gone.
It's not gone. It'll come back.
Well, I asked about that, and he said, well, it's something, I don't want to misquote him, I probably will, but my understanding was that there's a linear thought, and then there's the circular thought. And the linear thought is it will come back, and you have to keep visiting your childhood or whatever it is until you find out what it is, and then it will be gone. Versus the circular thought, which is it's just a discomfort right now, in the present, let it go, and it's gone. Poof. Next time. So I'd like to know if that's...
No. If you find yourself getting frazzled and trying to figure out why you go for this kind of thinking, that's the time you say, I'm just going to let it go for the time being. But you're doing this strategically. Say, next time it comes around, I want to catch it.
So more of the curious mind, right?
Keep up the curious mind. I want to understand this.
So if it becomes an agitated mind, then just like...
Let it go. And if part of your mind says, hey, I want to hold on to this, say, why? And you say, just because. Well, that's not an answer. I want to know why. And it's kind of a back and forth. It's kind of a dialogue. And at some point, the mind will reveal itself as to why it really likes that kind of thinking. And when you can see how stupid it was, that's when you let it go. And then when you let go that way, then it's gone.
So it's not a specific thing. You're not looking for an incident that happened in your life.
Oh, not necessarily. It's what you think you're getting out of it right now. Now, you don't have to trace it back to childhood. It's when I go for this, why am I going? What's the allure? I think I'm going to get out of this? And sometimes it's just a quick little, momentary thought. And if you catch that, which is why we practice concentration, then you see, oh my gosh, that was so dumb, because I know that I don't really get that out of this, but there was some part of me that was still.
Oh, it's a misguided pleasure.
Yeah, it's a misguided pleasure. And so think of it more just kind of like catching a thief in the act. You say, oops, I missed him the last time. Okay, I'm going to catch him the next time. At some point, you'll catch him. Yes?
I'm wondering if you can elaborate a bit more on the image about a mother protecting her own son. I often think of protecting all beings as the analogy that Buddha is trying to make.
Actually, the passage says protecting your mind state, the way the mother would protect a child. Which means, okay, in every situation, I'm going to try to protect my goodwill for the people around me. With that same, as I said, just as she would be willing to risk her life, I'm going to risk my life by trying to maintain my goodwill. That's something you can actually do. You can't risk your life for everybody in the universe. And you can't cherish everybody. I'm sure you can think of a few people right off the top of your head, people you don't really cherish. But you do cherish the fact that I can maintain my goodwill in the face of whatever. That's something you can maintain. It's not easy, but it can be done. And that's actually what the passage says.
So goodwill can, I think you said something earlier about not picking up. Not sure what word you used, but anyway. So goodwill is also, I think this is what you had said, something about, it's also not engaging or picking up or proliferating around things that aren't wholesome. So that internal dialogue that might be building up when I think of somebody that I don't have a lot of great feelings about, actions or comments or anything like that. When I see myself or feel that unwholesomeness arise, goodwill is, I'm not going there, I'm not picking that up, I'm not playing with that, I'm not engaging. I don't have to feel good about even myself for doing that, although that does feel better. I can just...
Yeah, so it's for my own good that I am not engaging in this kind of thinking.
And that's...
That's goodwill. That's good enough. That's good enough, yeah.
Okay.
You don't have to churn up warm fuzzies for Congress or whatever, Yes?
There seems to be like the flavor in this notion of goodwill, is metta, goodwill, the relationship of that to equanimity, and I'm just wondering if these...
Okay, there are 4 Brahma Viharas. There's goodwill, compassion, empathetic joy, equanimity. The first 3 are expressed, may all beings be happy, may all beings be free from suffering, may all beings not be deprived of the good fortune they have. That's basically a wish. Equanimity starts out with, all beings are the owners of their actions, a statement of fact. And what equanimity is you run up against the fact that there are beings out there, you want to be happy, you want to see them doing the causes of happiness and benefiting from them. They're not doing it. No matter how much you want them to do it, they're not going to do that. At least for the time being. For that, you have to have equanimity. So it's kind of a balance, and it's kind of a reality check. I was in France last May, and I was looking at their chanting book, and they had the Brahma Viharas, and they had it, may, and then the last was, may all beings be the owners of their actions. And as I told them, this sounds like a curse. So they're changing it. Yeah. Yes.
Can you just say a little bit more with what you were just talking about with in Thailand with people who, the peasants who live in the countryside and are practicing the Dhamma, and that it's more inward. I was really curious about how you were describing that. That it's not. You were saying something about goodwill and.
There's more of a sense of each person has a little bit of a shell, and there are only certain people you're going to allow into your shell. The idea of being vulnerable to everybody, they wouldn't buy that at all, because they live in a difficult, dangerous society. I mean, I noticed this, especially prior to 2001, the distinction between Buddhism in the West and Buddhism in Thailand was right around this issue, was that in the West they were talking about interconnectedness is a wonderful thing, we should learn to be more open and more vulnerable. Whereas over there they're saying, look, we're living in a dangerous world, we need protection. And so when you think about, people over there, the way they speak, and this was in the forest tradition, it's like someone who plays poker with his cards close to his chest. Very careful about what they say, who they open themselves up to. I mean, goodwill for everybody, but this sense of I have to be open to everybody, no. You have to protect yourself. My teacher had a student who was a seamstress, and some of her customers found out that she liked to meditate and go to the monastery. And they say, hey, wait a minute, people go to the monastery and meditate, they shouldn't be charging high prices for their clothing like this. And she figured, the prices I'm charging are fair, but how do I respond to someone like that? So she went to see Ajaan Fuang, and he said, tell them I'm not going to the monastery to become stupid. So you're in a dangerous situation, you don't open up. And you can be kind, but there are certain things you hold in reserve. Yes?
Can we expand upon how the four Brahma Viharas, how they support one another?
Okay, the first in developing...
In just the development, how they become a support for one another. So if you're developing equanimity, goodwill is helping that, or sympathetic joy and compassion.
Okay, well the first three are basically the same thing. I.e., you've got goodwill for everybody. And the second one, you see people are suffering, what does goodwill feel? It feels compassion. You see people are happy, goodwill feels empathetic joy. And not only see people who are suffering, but also people who are creating the causes for suffering, you have to have compassion for them. People who are doing things that will lead to happiness, you feel good for them, empathetic joy. With equanimity, you realize, okay, if I want everybody to be happy, but there are people who are not acting on the causes, and no matter how much I try to help work in that direction, it's not going to help. That's just a lot of waste of energy. And when you're putting your energy there, where it's wasted, you're ignoring other areas where actually you might be able to make a difference. So equanimity says, okay, I have to just put this aside, at least for the time being, and focus on areas where I really can make a difference, can be of help. So equanimity is kind of a reality check on the other three. That's how it keeps them going. Mm-hmm.
You were saying earlier that when my mind is doing something unwholesome, like engaging in remorse, that I'm doing that because I think it's going to create happiness in the future?
Either that, or do you think there's something I should be doing? I should be doing this. I'm not a good Buddhist unless I feel a lot of remorse, or something along those lines.
Right. I think it's making me a better person.
Right. Mm-hmm. And that's a kind of happiness.
Right. So I guess I thought there's a lot of what we do that just creates that sense of self, and that's the thing that we like. Oh, I'm a person who's doing really poorly right now, or something.
That's not necessarily always the case.
So it's actually catching a thief in the night is like saying, oh, I think I'm going to be better and happier in the future because that's an example of
or whatever it is. I mean, yourself is not always a culprit. Sometimes your sense of self can be an aid. So you can't just make a general blanket statement, okay, it's my sense of self that's causing all this problem, I got to get rid of that. Some of yourselves are actually useful. But I say this particular thing, the reason I feel this remorse and the reason I keep going over and over and over again, like picking an old scab, is that something inside me tells me that I should be doing this, that this is a duty I have, or I'm insensitive, or I don't feel remorse, or whatever the reasoning is.
And so seeing that, like if I'm seeing that, if there's something that will make sense in there. Oh,
yeah.
I see that.
I see why I did that. But it makes sense in a way that's stupid.
The self-logic makes sense.
Yes. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that's what they say a farce is. It's an illogical proposition carried to its logical conclusion. And in that way, a lot of our thinking is farcical. There's an illogical seed in there, but it reasons itself. So you want to check. And each instance of doing something like that is going to have its own particular reasons. There's no one blanket say, all my unskillful thoughts can be resolved in one little kernel. They have their own individual unskillful motivations.
That's helpful because right now I'm really interested in how much I crave a sense of success and thinking of myself, if I do this, then I'll be successful. And it's really useful to sort of look through that prism, or that way of looking, but it's not going to be everything.
No. Right.
Just to clarify, what in the talk you spoke of the factors coming before the Four Noble Truths? Goodwill, is that what you're saying?
Goodwill is one of the things that grows from the Four Noble Truths. I mean, it comes down to that question about wisdom, is what when I do would lead to my long-term welfare and happiness, and you realize long-term is going to have to involve goodwill for others. Otherwise the happiness is not going to last. And so you're looking for a path. So in this way it is kind of a prerequisite attitude for the Noble Truths. I mean, the Noble Truths are all about putting an end to suffering, which is an element of goodwill. It's an application of your wisdom in a way that services goodwill. Yes?
Could you just restate the metaphor that you were referencing about the moon and the stars and generosity?
And they say that goodwill is like the moon.
Goodwill is like the moon.
Yes, and generosity and virtue are like the stars, and that's much brighter than the stars. But we wouldn't want to have a sky with just a moon.